The Exorcist gave birth to the possession horror film and is one of the most profound horror films that's ever been made. So let's dig into the reasons why and also analyze the meticulously brilliant direction of director William Friedkin. In this video, I want to break down some of the major reasons why The Exorcist is so profound and why it's considered one of the all-time great horror films throughout film history. So I'm incredibly excited to get into today's video where we dissect all things Exorcist, William Friedkin's masterful direction, and at times unethical direction, and why I think it's one of the all-time great films that's ever been made and is such a product of its time when it was made in the 70s. So let's get into it. If you're new here, I'm Jordan and welcome back to my channel. I'm a narrative writer, director, and producer, and have been working in LA for the last 10 years. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. In this video, I really want to analyze the intense realism and documentary style of filmmaking that William Friedkin embraced for the making of The Exorcist, and also why so many of the scenes really take their time and really allow you to settle into the dialogue and develop the characters in such a profound way that really makes us feel for them as the audience and really get to know them in such a way that when the horror eventually happens to them later in the film, we feel all the more heartbreak and invested in the characters because we've really taken the time in the first whole half of the film to get to know them before any true horror really ever happens. For some background, The Exorcist was first released in theaters on December 26th of 1973 by Warner Brothers. Often considered one of the scariest films of all time, especially when it came out in the 70s, The Exorcist really gave birth to the possession or exorcism horror film that is still really popular in today's horror landscape. I really do believe The Exorcist will go down in history as one of the most terrifying and influential horror films of all time. So with that set up, let's dive in. William Friedkin, who had done films before like The French Connection, was known for his very intense, realistic, and documentary style approach to filmmaking that often involved extremely intense and rigorous production shoots, but also different techniques that were potentially unethical to try to get his actors to react as realistically as possible within the scenes on camera so that he could elicit the most surprising and genuinely shocking reactions that he could, especially in his approach to The Exorcist. Friedkin was also known for his unflinching attention to detail that bordered on obsessive and extremely meticulous. One of the techniques that Friedkin utilized, especially in the production of The Exorcist, is a concept called enforced method acting. Essentially, forced method acting is when a director sets up different surprises or does not let the cast members on specific secrets or things that are going to happen when they actually roll the camera. And what this does is leads the actor to have a completely genuine reaction, or at least that's the hope. But oftentimes the actor has no idea what's coming. They don't have any way to prepare for it. So many directors, especially in today's context, consider this practice fairly unethical, especially since actors sometimes get injured. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't have any way to mentally prepare for what's to come. And so in this film in particular, there were at least a few injuries from actor Burstyn, who plays Chris McNeil, the mother character, and Linda Blair, who plays Regan. Different stunts and rigs that they had sometimes were so intense that the actresses on different occasions actually ended up getting a real injury that delayed the production and ultimately affected both of their physical healths ever since those productions that are still things that they deal with. So I think it was just something that certain directors were doing probably more often back then. And to be honest, they probably had a little less checks and balances as far as this behavior. So not to play moral god here, but I really do believe there are different ways to achieve these effects ethically as a director without having to potentially hurt your actors or have them act in the dark or enforce method acting that they never really signed up for in the first place. William Friedkin was also known for an intense, naturalistic, and documentary style of filmmaking. He was very committed to making the film look and feel as realistic as possible with the cinematography, with the lighting, and with the camera work, and he really wanted the whole film to feel like you were watching reality play out as if you were watching a documentary of this happening. So I think you really feel that when you watch the film. Nothing really feels overlit or too glossy. It really does feel like the locations are lit with mostly natural light. Even the main house that's used in the film, they really feel like they just stepped into the house and started shooting it. One of the things that I think this achieves is it really makes it feel like the film is all the more terrifying because it feels even more realistic. Doesn't have that extra layer of cinematic detachment, and the possession happens in full effect of Regan, and some of the supernatural effects start happening happening. They're shot so realistically and practically. That's one thing that I think The Exorcist really achieves on such a high level that really makes itself stand out amongst many of its horror film predecessors or supernatural horror films of that era. But also, when you look at the modern day possession horror films, they are much more fantastical in a lot of ways. And I think as a result, sometimes they don't feel quite as scary or harrowing. I think even when you look at the camera work, there's a lot of instances where the camera goes handheld and it sometimes almost feels a little bit bumpy and not quite as finessed. And I love that. I think that really adds to the feel of the documentary, where obviously when you're shooting a documentary, you have to be nimble. You might have shakier camera movement because you don't know what you're going to capture. You're catching it in real time and just trying to get the best angle on whatever is playing out in front of you. What are your thoughts on enforced method acting? Do you think it's ethical or unethical? And if so, why or why not? So comment below, since I'd love to hear your thoughts. Another element of Friedkin's insistence on intense realism was that the set itself in the house was refrigerated. So they had the room set with a refrigerator that they literally built and put above the actual set for the room. And it was so cold that it got literally 40 degrees below zero in that bedroom on the actual set. And so I think when you see all of the actors who are in that bedroom, they're wearing jackets, their breath is coming out, and you can actually see the real breath because of how actually cold it is. You realize they're all freezing their butt off shooting this, and it feels cold. One of the other things that I really want to single out that is absolutely fantastic in the film is the practical and special effects makeup, especially on Regan's face when she gets possessed. The makeup team was led by legendary makeup artist Dick Smith, and I absolutely love how incredibly creepy, scary, but also grounded all of the makeup is. I really like that they predominantly use Linda Blair's face and they just put the makeup over it. They also put the makeup on the stunt double for Linda Blair named Eileen Dietz, who also performed some of the stunts where there was the rocking bed and some of the other more intense elements of the shoot. We know there's this demon externally. She has cut up her own face and there's scars and it's starting to decay, but we also still see the Regan beneath it that we know is trapped within there, and makes it all the more terrifying but also heartbreaking. Another thing I really want to shout out that I think is just fantastic work here is the voice actor Mercedes McCambridge. It's actually a woman's voice who is the Pazuzu, the devil voice once Regan gets possessed, and I love how incredibly creepy it is. It's just amazing, her voice acting in this film, especially to get to match up with Regan's voice. The soul is mine. And what I read is that Mercedes McCambridge chain smoked a bunch of cigarettes, drank a bunch of whiskey, had a bunch of just raw eggs on the day she would record the voiceovers with Friedkin, and that helped achieve that incredibly raspy, just raw quality of her voice that you hear throughout the film. So to confront this cruel demon. I think one of the other major structural elements that really makes this film work on so many levels and resonate is the fact that Friedkin's approach to the film really was to not make it like a traditional horror film. In fact, he even said in interviews he didn't consider it a horror film. He was just trying to make a film that felt as realistic as possible, was grounded in the characters and their stories and their arcs. And I think we really see that. He really took a very gradual approach to developing the film, especially in the first half. I think the first whole half of the film almost just feels like a grounded drama where we're learning about these characters and their predicaments. And really the horror doesn't start to come in till almost an hour into the film. So I think what that shows you is we really have time to develop our story and our characters. And this is extremely important because when the horror starts happening later, we're already invested in the characters. We already care. It feels even more terrifying when things are happening to them because we have taken the time to develop them. So I think a lot of horror films can take note from this structure of sometimes you don't have to thrust us into the horror right away. You can introduce it much later. If we're already invested in the story and characters, we'll already be on that ride. So sometimes you don't have to rely on cheap jump scares and thrills. You can just make a great story. And if the story is great, we'll be along for whatever horror is to come. But first you have to get us invested in those characters. And I know I harp about it a lot on this channel, but I really think a lot of my favorite scenes in this movie are dialogue scenes that really allow us to get to know the characters better. They're not really the scenes where there's more horror or scares or thrill. It's really the ones where we get to see who these people are so we know who we're going on this journey with. And perhaps the most profound arc arc is Father Karras, played by Jason Miller. I really love that we see at the beginning of the film, he's going through his own crisis of faith, and by the end, he commits the ultimate act of faith when he has the demon come into him so that he can jump out of the window, kill the demon, put it to bed so it gets out of Regan in such a selfless way. One of the things I really like about the Georgetown steps that become such a consistent visual runner in this film is earlier in the film, the director character, Burke, he's thrown out of the window by Regan, ostensibly, and he falls to his death at the bottom of those steps. And when Father Karras also dies, he also dies at the bottom of those steps. And I've talked about this before when we did our Nightmare on Elm Street video, but I really do think there's this symbolism of descending a staircase often, especially in a horror film. To me is always that metaphor of we're descending downward to hell or a place that is otherworldly from where we are on higher ground. Or in this way, I guess you could say maybe it's heaven, especially if Father Karras did sacrifice himself. He probably would go to heaven, not hell, I would assume. So in this way, I still think there's a symbolic metaphor there. After doing some research, I really appreciated that the first scene in the film when we meet Father Marin, played by Max von Sydow, who's in this image here, I really love that we introduce him in northern Iraq. And when you actually look at what is modern day northern Iraq, what you realize is that's where ancient Babylon and Assyria were. And when you look at Pazuzu, which is the devil that actually possesses Regan in particular, what you find is that Pazuzu is based off a lot of the demons and mythology that is in ancient Assyrian and Babylonian mythology. So I like that there's actually some major significance to why we spend some time in Iraq. He sees the statue of Pazuzu and the small little head of it, and this really symbolizes to Father Marin, Pazuzu is coming back at some point. And William Peter Blatty, who's the screenwriter who also produced The Exorcist and wrote the novel that the movie's based off of, he had stated that the fictional Pazuzu demon was based off one of the wind gods that was in Assyrian and Babylonian mythology. So I think what this opening scene fully showcases to us as well is the strength of Friedkin's direction, especially the commitment to the documentary style. It really does feel like we're watching a real archaeological dig in Iraq when this film opens. I just think the camera work of the dollies, seeing men just hacking almost machine-like into the dirt to try to find things. It's just a very interesting excavation into ancient history that ends up playing a role in the future of this film as well. So I like that we have such a interesting location that is so different from the Georgetown we get to in the rest of the film. But I really think the filmmaking, the shot compositions, the camera work, and the camera movement throughout the sequence are excellently done. One other note is the cinematographer Owen Roisman. He shot a lot of William Friedkin's movies, did an excellent job of capturing everything and making it look as realistic as possible. I really do think it looks like the documentary style. One of the more simple scenes in the film, but I think is an absolutely crucial scene that's incredibly well directed and acted, is the scene between Regan and Chris, where we really get to know their dynamic as mother and daughter. And I think this is such an amazing scene because it's very simple. It's just them talking while Regan is getting tucked in, but it does two things for us. For one, it showcases how sweet and normal of a little girl Regan is. She's 12 years old.
No, I love you. Oh, I love you.
But she's also smart, she's astute, and we see that she has very strong powers of observation because she observes the relationship with her mother that her mother's trying to keep on the down low, with the film director of the film that the mother's acting in.
You can bring Mr. Dennings if you like.
Mr. Dennings?
She's very kind, and she and her mother have a really great relationship. And the second thing we establish is that Chris really is a great mother. She tucks in Regan, she loves her. They really feel like they have a genuinely real and loving dynamic as mother and daughter.
You're gonna marry him, aren't you?
Oh, my God. Are you kidding me, Mary?
We also established that the father is not in the picture. We don't quite 100% know yet. We come to find out that he actually is alive, but he's in Europe. We don't fully know what he's doing, but he's not there.
You don't like him like Daddy?
Regan, I love you, Daddy.
What it really shows you is that Chris and Regan have really had to bond together and really make this family almost just with them too. I think that brings them even closer and is all the more heartbreaking when we see how sweet Regan is and how much Chris cares about her, when Regan's personality completely shifts to this monstrous, aggressive, and profane demon that's inside of her. It feels so unlike Regan that you can see her mother in real time starting to have this breakdown of what happened to my daughter. She knows it's something more than just a personality or a psychology thing. And it really does take them over half the film for all the scientists to finally realize maybe something else is going on here, supernatural, that's not just science. Chris never gives up on her daughter. She's the one advocate through the whole movie who has to convince every other expert that really what they need to do is an exorcism, not any of these other science experiments that aren't going anywhere. Deep down, she truly knows this isn't Regan. One of the strengths of the film is the performances. Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn are just amazing here. They just feel so realistic. And again, it supports the idea of the documentary realism. Dialogue just feels realistic. And I think that's a testament to the filmmaking abilities, the screenwriting of William Peter Blatty, and the performances from the actors. Another simple but pivotal scene that I really like that we establish is Father Karras questioning his faith. I love that we get to see a little more about who this man is. And Father Karras, played by Jason Miller, does a really good job of channeling this internal conflict. I think the whole movie, in his eyes, you just see there's a conflict. There's a wariness that he wears on his expression, which I think is also great casting. Jason Miller just carries that with him when he walks around. I think this is a really important moment for us to see that even though he's a father, he's a member of the Catholic faith, he's questioning his own faith. He's having his own crisis of faith and really questioning if he should do this job where he's a psychiatrist that counsels the priests for Georgetown University.
I think I've lost my faith, Tom.
I think for a lot of people who've been religious, there is that realistic moment of you question it. Do I still believe? Do I not? For one, I think that's healthy, but I also think this is normal, especially for someone who's grown up with this maybe their whole life. We also get to learn a little bit more about the fact that his mother is ill, she is dying, and he does feel this regret of, should I spend more time with her? Should I have kept her in New York City where we were before?
It's my mother, Tom. She's alone. I never should have left her.
There's very much this conflict that he's grappling with. And I definitely think it goes into that idea of the Catholic guilt that sometimes people joke about. This is a perfect example of him seeing this guilt on many levels and it really weighing on him. And I think Father Karras is the perfect candidate who ends up helping with the exorcism later in the film and is chosen and sought out by Chris, mainly because he is still questioning. He is able to be objective and say, do I really believe? He's not just blindly accepting that his faith is everything and there's no questioning to it. So what that says to me is he's a very reasonable person who can absolutely still question, still ask himself, does this mean a lot to me? And he's clearly the kind of person who can't lie about something he doesn't really believe in. So I think this makes it all the more powerful later on in the film when he does kind of fully commit and say, I do believe, when he has the demon come into him. So right around 38 minutes into our film is the biggest tonal shift in the film, in my opinion. Up until then, Regan is still relatively normal. She's still the sweet little girl that we come to know. And really, there's no major sources of conflict until at a dinner party that Chris throws where everybody is singing at the piano. Regan walks in and says,
You're gonna die up there.
Pees on the carpet. This moment right here completely changes the tone. It's almost like the rug is pulled out from the viewer until the very end of the film. We are now in a different kind of movie that's only going to get more and more horrific and terrifying and intense. So up until this point, we've had 38 minutes of really laying the groundwork for who these characters are, who's Regan, who's Chris, who's Father Karras. And I think these 38 minutes are so crucial because it gives us chance to lower our defenses. I think Friedkin really brings us in as an audience, especially if this is the first time you're watching the film. You just think, oh, this is an interesting story about characters in Georgetown. There's some people in Iraq. What's happening here? You're still trying to figure out what's going on, but you're never thrust into anything. And so your defenses are lowered. When she pees immediately, it's such a jarring effect that now we really feel even more disturbed by it than if you thrust us into horror in the first minute of the film, which a lot of horror films do. So I think this is an exceptional choice that distinguishes itself. I really like when we show Karras' nightmare after his mother has just passed away. Clearly he's been feeling this intense guilt about, did he do enough for her? Did he visit her? And he sees his mother in this nightmare. And there's this very essential close-up of the chain, I believe it's a rosary, that's falling down. That again also has significance later in the film. And this is also the very first time that we flash the Pazuzu face, which is the demon that has infiltrated Regan, or is just starting to. And what's interesting is the stunt double for Linda Blair, named Eileen Dietz. That's actually her face that we flash whenever we see the Pazuzu. She's the one who had that makeup when we flash the face. So this is also symbolic to the viewer as well, because we're somewhat in the subjective point of view of Karras in his nightmare. But I also think there's the possibility that Father Karras is potentially even having a premonition of Pazuzu, what's to come, when he sees this face in his nightmare. Because in theory, we're seeing it in his nightmare. So it's not necessarily an omniscient thing we're seeing, though it also could be. So I like that it's vague, but it's something that you can interpret either way, I think. When we move into around 47 minutes into the film, this is when we see probably the most intense possession sequence to date for Regan, and it has all started to take on an entirely different cadence to how intense the shot compositions are. Her screaming is more intense. It just takes on this whole another level of energy in the way that they capture it.
Stop! It's burning! It's burning!
Do something, doctor, please help her.
And it's pretty disturbing, to be honest. I mean, I think, again, when you think about the microphones of the 70s, and the sheer rawness of when people screamed. I talked a little bit about this for the Nightmare on Elm Street videos. It's so raw and visceral. When I hear Regan and Chris screaming with the old microphones that weren't as sharp, it makes me feel like there's a level of distortion that just creeps me out. It really makes me feel like the hairs on my forearm stand on end whenever I watch this scene. And I think this is also where we fully start to introduce the audience to the severity of the problem. And that this is absolutely something that's way beyond the realm of science, and it's now in the realm of the supernatural. That concludes why The Exorcist is one of the most profound horror films of all time. I want to hear from you. Comment below your favorite memories of the first time that you watched The Exorcist, or what your favorite scene in the film is. Let me know if there's any other films that you want me to cover in a future video, and I will definitely make sure we get them covered. And for more movie breakdowns, you can definitely check out more of my videos like this series that I did on A Nightmare on Elm Street, which you can find here, so definitely give it a watch. And stay tuned for next week, where we'll continue to break down different scenes from great horror films from a writing and directing standpoint. So I will definitely see you then.